They stood in front of cameras with tears streaming down their faces. They begged for their children's safe return. They organized search parties. They spoke to reporters. They did everything that devastated parents of missing children are supposed to do. The world watched Malehya Brooks Murray and Daniel Martell and saw grief, saw desperation, saw parents living through every parent's worst nightmare. But behind the tears, behind the carefully crafted public statements, behind the performance of anguish, investigators were seeing something entirely different. They were seeing inconsistencies. They were seeing lies. They were seeing behavior that didn't match the story being told. And as the investigation into the disappearance of 6-year-old Lily Sullivan and 4-year-old Jack Sullivan progressed, as evidence accumulated and witness statements were analyzed and forensic results came back, a disturbing picture emerged. This might not be a tragedy. This might be a crime. And the people responsible might be the very ones standing in front of cameras asking for help finding their children. This is the story of how Malehya Brooks Murray and Daniel Martell almost fooled the world, how they constructed a narrative about children wandering into the wilderness that began to crumble under the weight of evidence, how small lies became big lies, how suspicious behavior became damning behavior, and how what started as a missing persons case evolved into something far darker. This is the story of deception, of manipulation, of a performance so calculated that it almost worked. And this is the story of 2 children who deserved so much better than what they got from the adults who were supposed to protect them. Before we expose the lies and analyze the evidence that's been hidden from public view until now, you need to subscribe to True Crime Vault and hit that notification bell immediately. We don't just report on cases, we investigate them. We ask the questions mainstream media won't ask. We demand accountability when others stay silent. If you want unflinching, thorough coverage of cases where the truth matters, subscribe right now. Smash that like button because it pushes this content to more people, and the more eyes on cases like this, the harder it becomes for guilty parties to hide. Drop your thoughts in the comments as we go through this evidence. What do you think really happened? Let's build this case together as a community. Now let's dive into how 2 people tried to get away with the unthinkable. May 2nd, 2025 started like any other day in the rural community of Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia. The sun rose over Pictou County, bringing with it the promise of a spring day in Canada's maritime provinces. People went about their morning routines, completely unaware that within hours this small community would become the center of a case that would captivate the nation. And at 10:01 a.m., a 911 call came in that would change everything. Malehya Brooks Murray was calling to report that her 2 children, 6-year-old Lily and 4-year-old Jack, had vanished from their property. The story she told the 911 operator was simple, straightforward, the kind of scenario that unfortunately happens. The children had been playing in the backyard of their rural property. She and her partner, Daniel Martell, had been inside with their 1-year-old daughter, Meadow, for what they said was just a short time. They could hear the children, could hear them playing. Everything seemed normal. But then the house went quiet. Too quiet. When they came out to check on Lily and Jack, the children were gone. Simply vanished. The back gate was open. The dense wilderness that surrounded their isolated property on Gairloch Road stretched out in all directions, a dangerous maze of forest, ravines, and thick undergrowth. And somewhere out there, according to Malehya, were 2 small children who had wandered off and gotten lost. The 911 operator kept her on the line, trying to get more details, trying to establish exactly when the children had last been seen, what they were wearing, whether there were any medical concerns. Police were dispatched immediately. This was treated as an emergency, as it should be. 2 young children lost in wilderness where temperatures at night could drop near freezing, where terrain was treacherous, where a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old would have absolutely no survival skills. Every minute mattered. And within hours, one of the largest search operations in Nova Scotia's history was underway. Volunteers flooded the area, responding to calls on social media and local radio. Over 100 people showed up that first day, ordinary citizens who wanted to help find 2 children they'd never met. Police officers from multiple detachments arrived. Specialized search and rescue teams deployed with training and equipment for wilderness searches. Cadaver dogs were brought in, German shepherds and other breeds trained to detect human remains. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept overhead, their cameras capable of detecting body heat even through moderate tree cover. Drones flew grid patterns over areas too dense or dangerous for ground teams. Every resource available was thrown at finding two small children who had apparently wandered into dangerous terrain. And Malehya Brooks Murray and Daniel Martell played their parts perfectly. They appeared before cameras looking absolutely devastated. Malehya could barely speak through her tears as she begged for her children's return. Her voice cracked with emotion as she said she just wanted them home, that she couldn't spend another night without them in their beds. Daniel stood beside her, jaw clenched, hands shaking slightly, looking like a man barely holding himself together. The image of a stepfather who loved these children as if they were his own, who was destroyed by their disappearance. They released home videos of the children to the media, footage of Lily laughing, her blonde hair catching the sunlight as she played on the swings, video of Jack running around the yard, his energy and joy captured on film that would now be watched by thousands of people hoping these kids would be found alive. They did everything the playbook says grieving parents should do. They cooperated with police. They participated in searches. They made emotional appeals. They asked anyone with information to come forward, and the world's heart broke for them. News coverage was extensive. Social media exploded with shared posts about the missing children. Vigils were held. Ribbons were tied to trees. Everyone in Nova Scotia and across Canada was hoping, praying for a miracle. But while the public saw grief, while citizens and media were moved by the parents' obvious anguish, investigators were taking notes. They were watching body language with trained eyes. They were listening to exact words used and noting patterns. They were observing what was said and what wasn't said. They were beginning the process every detective knows is essential in missing children cases. You start with the family. You start with the parents. You eliminate them as suspects before you look elsewhere. Because statistically, tragically, that's where most answers are found. When a child goes missing or is harmed, the people closest to them are usually responsible. It's an uncomfortable truth, but it's truth nonetheless. And the more investigators looked at Malehya Brooks Murray and Daniel Martell, the more closely they examined their statements and their behavior and their timeline, the more things didn't add up. Small inconsistencies at first, details that shifted between tellings. But as the investigation progressed, as evidence was gathered and witnesses were interviewed and forensic analysis was conducted, those small inconsistencies grew into major red flags. And investigators began to suspect they weren't dealing with a tragic accident of children wandering off. They were dealing with something much darker. Let's start with the timeline, because this is where the whole carefully constructed story begins to fall apart. According to Malehya and Daniel, the children were home on May 2nd because Lily had a cough. She wasn't feeling well enough to go to school, so they kept both children home. They'd also been home the day before, May 1st, for the same reason. And they'd been home on April 30th, but that was because there was no school that day, a professional development day for teachers. So we have 3 consecutive days, April 30th, May 1st, and May 2nd, where Lily and Jack Sullivan were not in school. 3 days where no teachers or other mandatory reporters were seeing them, checking on their well-being. 3 days where their safety and care depended entirely on what was happening inside that isolated house on Gairloch Road. Now, keeping a sick child home from school is completely normal. Parents do it all the time. But when children then disappear, when they go missing under suspicious circumstances, investigators look very carefully at those days leading up to the disappearance. They want to know who saw the children. They want independent verification that the kids were alive and well. They want witnesses outside the family who can confirm the children's status. And here's where the timeline gets very problematic for Malehya and Daniel. The last time anyone outside the immediate family can definitively verify seeing Lily and Jack alive was May 1st at 2:25 p.m. Security cameras at a Dollarama store in the neighboring town of New Glasgow captured footage of the family shopping together. Malehya pushing a shopping cart with baby Meadow in it, Daniel walking alongside, and Lily and Jack walking with the family, looking at items on shelves, behaving exactly like any children in a store would behave. That footage is time-stamped, verified, undeniable. At 2:25 p.m. on May 1st, 2025, Lily and Jack Sullivan were alive. The security camera doesn't lie. It's objective evidence that cannot be disputed. Investigators obtained additional footage from traffic cameras along the route the family traveled that day. They tracked the family's vehicle through multiple intersections, documenting their movements throughout the afternoon. And that traffic camera footage shows the family's vehicle returning to the Lansdowne area by approximately 4:15 p.m. So we know they left Dollarama around 2:30 p.m. We know they were back in their home area by 4:15 p.m. About 2 hours accounted for by objective verifiable evidence. And then what happened? This is where everything relies solely on the word of Malehya Brooks Murray and Daniel Martell. According to them, they went home and had a completely normal evening. The children played, they had dinner, they watched some television perhaps. They went through a normal evening routine. Then they put the kids to bed somewhere between 9 and 10 p.m. And here's the first inconsistency. In Malehya's initial statement to police, she said she put the children to bed at 9 p.m. But in a subsequent interview, she changed that time to 10 p.m., an hour difference. When investigators asked about the discrepancy, she said she wasn't sure, that she was confused about the timing, that everything was a blur. But when you're being asked to account for the last time you saw your children alive, you should remember. That detail should be burned into your memory. According to their story, they had a normal night. Daniel stayed up after Malehya went to bed, though she didn't know what time he eventually came to bed. The children were supposedly in their rooms, sleeping peacefully. Everything was fine. And then the next morning, May 2nd, sometime between 8 and 9:40 a.m., according to their vague timeline, the children disappeared. Malehya and Daniel claimed they were in the bedroom with baby Meadow during this time. They could hear Lily coming in and out of the room. They could hear Jack in the kitchen, normal morning sounds, and then suddenly, silence. When they investigated, the children were gone. But here's the massive problem with this timeline. Nobody saw those children after 4:15 p.m. on May 1st, when the family vehicle was captured returning to the Lansdowne area. Not one independent witness can verify that Lily and Jack were alive after that point. Janie McKenzie, Daniel's mother, who lived in a separate building on the property, claims she heard children playing on the swings the morning of May 2nd around 8:50 or 9 a.m. But when investigators pressed her for details, when they asked exactly what she experienced, she admitted something crucial. She never actually saw the children that morning. She was in her building, in bed, heard sounds from outside that she interpreted as children playing, children's laughter, the rhythmic creaking of swing chains. But she never looked out the window to visually confirm it was Lily and Jack. She never went outside to say good morning or interact with them. She heard sounds and assumed it was her grandchildren. So if we're being brutally honest about what can actually be verified through independent evidence, the last confirmed sighting of these children was at 2:25 p.m. on May 1st. That's 19 hours and 36 minutes before they were reported missing at 10:01 a.m. on May 2nd. 19 and a half hours where only Malehya Brooks Murray and Daniel Martell claimed to know what happened. 19 and a half hours with no independent verification that those children were alive. No neighbor who saw them. No delivery person who noticed them playing. No video footage from any source. Nothing except the word of two people whose story was already showing cracks. And when you're investigating a case and the only witnesses to a child's well-being during a critical time period are the people you suspect harmed that child, you have a very serious problem. You have no way to verify their story. You have to rely entirely on whether their account is consistent, believable, and supported by physical evidence. And in this case, none of those criteria were being met. Investigators pressed Malehya and Daniel extensively on the details of that evening and night. They asked specific, detailed questions. What exactly did you do after returning home from New Glasgow? What did the children eat for dinner? Who prepared it? Where did you eat? What were the children wearing? What was their mood? Did they seem sick since Lily supposedly had a cough bad enough to keep her home from school? What television shows did they watch? What time exactly did bath time or bedtime routines start? What books did you read to them? What were the last words they said to you? These are questions that parents of genuinely missing children can typically answer in detail. These final normal moments tend to be seared into memory because parents replay them obsessively, looking for any sign they missed, any warning of what was to come. But Malehya and Daniel's answers kept shifting. Small details changed between interviews. Times moved around. Activities became vaguer. Malehya would say one thing in an interview, then Daniel would say something slightly different when questioned separately. When confronted with the inconsistencies, they'd claim stress, claim they were confused, claimed they couldn't remember clearly because of the trauma. Now, these inconsistencies might seem minor to casual observers. Memory can be unreliable, especially under extreme stress. Nobody's perfect at recalling every detail, but investigators are trained to spot the difference between genuine memory problems and signs of a fabricated story. When people are telling the truth, the core facts stay consistent, even if small peripheral details vary. They might not remember the exact time something happened, but they remember the sequence of events. They might not recall exactly what was said, but they remember the gist of conversations. The foundation of truth remains solid even if details are fuzzy. But when people are lying, when they're trying to maintain a fabricated narrative, the story shifts because they're not recalling what actually happened. They're trying to remember what they said in previous interviews, trying to keep their lies straight, and inevitably, they slip up. Details contradict. Timelines shift. The story evolves in ways that truth doesn't. And Malehya and Daniel's story kept shifting in exactly those ways. The bedtime kept changing. The activities of the evening became vaguer the more they were pressed for details. Things that should have been crystal clear in the minds of parents whose children had just vanished were fuzzy or contradictory. Red flags were piling up in investigators' notes with every interview. Then there's the issue of Daniel Martell's behavior and movements on the night of May 1st. Remember, this is the last night anyone can independently confirm the children were alive. This is the crucial time period where whatever happened to Lily and Jack likely occurred. And we now know through security footage that investigators painstakingly obtained from a small gas station 30 kilometers from the Sullivan property that Daniel wasn't home all night like he claimed in his initial statements to police. The video footage, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. on May 1st, shows a vehicle that matches the description of Daniel's truck pulling into the gas station. A male figure exits the vehicle and begins pumping gas. The individual is wearing dark clothing, a hoodie pulled up over his head, making definitive facial identification difficult from the camera angles available. But forensic video analysts who examined the footage frame by frame, who compared vehicle characteristics and body measurements and movement patterns, determined there was better than 80% probability that the vehicle was Martell's truck and that the individual was Daniel Martell himself. The footage shows this person pumping gas for several minutes, then walking into the gas station's small convenience store. Interior cameras, which are slightly better quality than the exterior cameras, captured the individual inside for approximately 4 minutes. The person browsed various sections of the store, the kind of aimless wandering someone does when they're killing time or when they're distracted and thinking about something else. Picked up items from shelves, looked at them, put them back. The body language, analyzed by experts, suggested someone who was agitated, nervous, not really focused on shopping. Eventually, the person approached the counter, purchased a few items that aren't clearly visible in the footage, and left the store. Now here's why the security footage is so critically important, why it's such damning evidence against Daniel Martell's credibility. When investigators initially asked him to provide a detailed timeline of his movements and activities on the night of May the 1st, he stated clearly that he was home all evening. He said Malehya went to bed around 9 or 10 p.m., that he stayed up later watching television or scrolling on his phone, but that he remained at the house. He made absolutely no mention of leaving the property that night. When investigators compile timelines in cases like this, they ask suspects to account for their time hour by hour. Where were you? What were you doing? Who was with you? Who can verify your presence? It's standard investigative procedure. And Martell's timeline for the night of May 1st had him at home from dinner time through the entire night until the morning of May 2nd when the children allegedly disappeared. So if that security footage shows him at a gas station at 11:47 p.m., 30 kilometers from his house, he lied to police about his movements on the last night anyone can verify his stepchildren were alive. This isn't a small detail. This isn't a minor discrepancy. This is a provable, demonstrable lie about his whereabouts during the most critical time period in the investigation. And when suspects lie about their movements during the time frame when a crime likely occurred, that's consciousness of guilt. That's behavior indicating they have something to hide. When investigators confronted Daniel Martell with this security footage during a subsequent interview, his response evolved in ways that only increased suspicion rather than allaying it. His initial reaction was flat denial. He said it wasn't him in the video. Said it must have been someone else with a similar truck. Said the footage was too grainy and the lighting too poor to make a positive identification. He denied leaving the house that night, stuck to his original story. But when investigators pushed back, when they pointed out the vehicle characteristics that matched his truck, when they noted the license plate that, while partially obscured, appeared to match his registration, when they brought in the video analysis showing high probability it was him, his story suddenly changed. Then he admitted, okay, maybe he did go out that night. Maybe he took a drive. He'd forgotten about it, he claimed, because of all the stress and confusion of the missing children. His mind was in chaos, and a simple trip to the gas station had slipped through the cracks of his memory. He said maybe he went to get cigarettes or some snacks or something, nothing significant. Just a quick errand, which is why it didn't seem important enough to mention when giving his initial timeline. It was such a minor thing that it simply escaped his recollection. This is the explanation he offered for why he'd failed to mention leaving the property during the crucial time period. But investigators weren't buying it, and neither should anyone following this case. Because they checked. They looked at what that particular gas station sells. It's a small rural convenience store with limited inventory, the kind of place that stocks the basics for travelers and locals. And they don't sell cigarettes. So Martell's claim that he went there to buy cigarettes was immediately proven false. Strike one against his revised story. Furthermore, Martell's bank records show no debit or credit card transaction at that location that night. No electronic record of a purchase, which means if he did buy something, and the store's records suggest someone did make a purchase around that time, he paid with cash. Cash that had to come from somewhere. And remember those large cash withdrawals from Malehya's account in the 2 weeks before the disappearance? Over $2,000 withdrawn in amounts of $400, $600, $800 at a time. Cash that neither Malehya nor Daniel could adequately explain when asked what it was used for. This gas station purchase paid in cash starts to fit into a pattern of financial activity designed to avoid leaving an electronic trail. The interior security footage from the gas station is frustratingly incomplete in terms of what we can definitively see. The camera angles show the individual shopping, show him picking up various items and examining them, but don't clearly capture what specific items were ultimately taken to the counter and purchased. The store's transaction records from that night have been obtained by investigators, but without knowing the exact time of the purchase down to the precise minute, and without knowing which transaction was Martell's if he paid cash, they couldn't definitively link a specific list of purchased items to him. But investigators are very interested in what someone might need to buy at a gas station late at night that they'd be willing to lie about, that they'd pay cash for to avoid a paper trail. Cleaning supplies. Many gas stations stock basic cleaning products. Trash bags, definitely available. A tarp if the station happened to stock such things. Possibly. Rope or zip ties that might be on rotating wire racks. Maybe. We don't know what was purchased because the footage doesn't clearly show it and the transaction can't be definitively identified. But the questions are obvious and deeply disturbing. What does someone buy at nearly midnight on the last night their children are seen alive? What are they preparing for? And why lie about the entire trip? Let's think logically about the timeline this creates. If Daniel Martell was at that gas station at 11:47 p.m., he would have had to leave his house around 11:15 or 11:30 p.m. based on the driving distance and typical travel time. This is supposedly after Malehya had gone to bed, after the children had been put to bed hours earlier. He drove 30 kilometers to this particular gas station, spent time there buying something with cash, and then drove back. The footage shows him leaving the gas station, but there are no other cameras tracking his route home, so we can't verify when he actually returned to the property. Did he go straight home? Did it take him 25 or 30 minutes as it should? Or did he go somewhere else first? Did he take a detour? Was there another stop that didn't happen to be covered by security cameras? And perhaps most critically, what was happening at the house while he was gone? Were Malehya and the 3 children there? Were they asleep? Or had something already happened? Was Daniel disposing of something during this late-night drive? The questions are endless and troubling. And Daniel Martell's inability or unwillingness to provide a truthful, consistent, verifiable account of his movements that night makes him look extraordinarily guilty of something. Now let's talk about the financial evidence, because when you add the money trail to everything else, the picture becomes even more damning. Investigators obtained court orders to access the family's financial records for the months leading up to the disappearance. This is standard procedure in major investigations. Financial records can reveal planning, can show purchases related to a crime, can demonstrate motive through financial stress. And what investigators found in Malehya Brooks Murray's bank account raised serious red flags. The family was struggling financially. That much was clear from even a cursory review. They were living paycheck to paycheck, if they were even managing that, behind on rent for the property they were leasing, though they were apparently working something out with the landlord. Credit cards maxed out to their limits. A series of small loans taken out and not yet repaid. Daniel had lost a job several months earlier and was only working sporadically doing odd jobs for cash here and there. Malehya had part-time employment at a retail store, working maybe 20 to 25 hours a week, but earning only marginally above minimum wage. With 3 children to feed, clothe, and house, with utilities and transportation and all the other expenses of daily life, they were drowning. The kind of financial desperation that keeps people up at night, that leads to arguments and stress and despair. But what really caught investigators' attention were the cash withdrawals in the 2 weeks immediately before Lily and Jack disappeared. Starting around April 17th or 18th, there was a series of large cash withdrawals from Malehya's checking account. Not the usual $20 or $40 someone might take out for gas or incidentals. We're talking about substantial amounts. $800 withdrawn on April 18th, $600 on April 22nd, $450 on April 26th, another $500 on April 29th. Add it all up and you're looking at over $2,300 in cash withdrawn from an account that rarely had more than a few $100s in it at any given time. These withdrawals brought the account balance dangerously low, into overdraft territory in some cases. When investigators asked Malehya about these withdrawals during formal interviews, she couldn't provide clear, specific explanations. Her answers were vague and evasive. She said it was for various expenses around the house, said they needed things, couldn't remember specifically what, suggested maybe it was for groceries, though they typically paid for groceries with a debit card, and there were no corresponding grocery purchases that would account for those amounts. Maybe it was for bills, she offered, though investigators could see that their major bills, utilities and such, were paid electronically through automatic withdrawals or online payments. There was no evidence of cash payments to utilities or rent that would explain where over $2,000 went. When investigators turned the same questions to Daniel Martell, he gave different answers. He said Malehya handled the finances, that he didn't really keep track of what money was going where. He said he didn't know about specific withdrawals. Then he suggested maybe it was for bills, echoing Malehya's explanation. But when pressed for details, when asked which specific bills were paid in cash, he couldn't provide answers. The stories didn't match. Neither could account for where this money went. Now, large cash withdrawals aren't inherently suspicious in isolation. People withdraw cash for all kinds of legitimate reasons. Some people prefer to budget using physical money, using the envelope method where you withdraw your budget in cash and divide it into categories. Some people are buying things from private individuals who only accept cash, vehicles or furniture or equipment from Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. Some people just lose track of their spending and withdraw more than they realize over time. There are innocent explanations. But in the context of an investigation into missing children who may have been harmed, where investigators are looking for any indication of planning or unusual behavior that might relate to the crime, unexplained cash withdrawals totaling over $2,000 in the 2 weeks before the disappearance get very serious attention, because cash purchases leave no electronic trail. If you need to buy things related to committing a crime, things you don't want traced back to you, you pay cash. You go to different stores so no one location sees a suspicious bulk purchase. You buy cleaning supplies at one store, trash bags at another, tools at a third. You spread it out so it doesn't raise red flags. And you pay cash so there's no credit card statement showing what you bought, when, and where. I'm not saying that's definitively what this money was used for. I'm saying that's what investigators strongly suspect it was used for, and the fact that neither Malehya nor Daniel can provide a credible alternative explanation that accounts for where over $2,000 went makes that suspicion very reasonable. Money doesn't just vanish, it goes somewhere. Someone bought something or paid someone for something with that cash, and whatever it was, It's something they're not willing to admit to police. Then there's perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence that's emerged from this investigation. The internet search history. Forensic specialists seized electronic devices from the home, computers and tablets and smartphones under court-authorized search warrants. They extracted data from those devices, including internet browsing history, search engine queries, app usage, everything that creates a digital footprint. And what they found in the search history from the days immediately before the children disappeared is absolutely damning. In the 72 hours before May the 2nd, in that critical 3-day window from April 29th through May 1st, someone in that household was conducting very specific, very disturbing online searches. The exact search terms haven't been made fully public because this information could be critical evidence if charges are ever filed, and prosecutors don't want defense attorneys to have time to craft explanations before trial. But based on information that's leaked from sources close to the investigation, we know the general topics of these searches. Someone searched for information about how long children can survive in cold weather conditions. What happens to a child's body when exposed to temperatures near freezing? How quickly hypothermia sets in? Survival times based on age and body weight. These weren't casual searches. These were multiple queries drilling down into specific details, suggesting someone who needed precise information for a specific purpose. Someone searched for information about search and rescue procedures, how police conduct searches for missing persons, what resources are typically deployed, how long searches usually continue before being scaled back, what areas get searched first versus later, what methods are used to cover terrain. Again, multiple searches going deep into the topic, not just reading a single article but researching comprehensively. Someone searched for information about how police investigate missing children cases, what evidence investigators look for, how forensic analysis is conducted, what mistakes people make that lead to getting caught, how long it typically takes for cases to go cold, what percentage of missing children cases get solved. This is someone researching not out of idle curiosity but because they needed to know how to avoid detection. Think about this for a moment. In the 3 days before Lily and Jack Sullivan were reported missing, someone in the house where they lived was researching the exact scenario that would play out. Children going missing, police searching for them, investigative procedures and forensic techniques. This isn't coincidence. This isn't someone randomly reading news articles about unrelated cases. This is preparation. This is someone planning what they're going to do and researching how to do it without getting caught. When investigators confronted Malehya and Daniel about these searches during interviews, neither could provide a credible explanation. Malehya claimed she didn't remember making such searches, suggested maybe she'd been watching true crime documentaries on television and got curious about how investigations work, said she sometimes goes down rabbit holes online reading about random topics. But forensic analysts can tell the difference between casual browsing and targeted research. When someone is watching a documentary and casually Googles a related topic, they might read 1 or 2 articles and then move on to something else. But these searches weren't casual. They were focused, methodical, drilling down into specific information, multiple queries on the same topics, following links to more detailed sources. This is research with a purpose. Daniel's explanation was even weaker. He claimed maybe someone else was using their devices, maybe a visitor or family member who'd been at the house. But investigators had already established through witness interviews that no one outside the immediate household had been at the property during those days. No visitors, no extended family stopping by, just Malehya, Daniel, and the 3 children. So if someone in that house made those searches, it was either Malehya or Daniel. There's no third option, and neither can explain why someone would need that information unless they were planning something terrible. The physical evidence from the property adds another layer of disturbing findings. As the investigation progressed and the story of children wandering into wilderness became less credible, investigators shifted their focus to the property itself. If something happened to Lily and Jack, if they were harmed rather than lost, it most likely occurred in that house or somewhere on those grounds. And that meant conducting thorough forensic examination of every inch of the property. Cadaver dogs were brought to the property multiple times over the course of several weeks following the disappearance. These aren't ordinary search dogs trained to find living people. These are animals who have undergone years of specialized training to detect the scent of human decomposition. They can find remains buried 6 feet underground. They can detect decomposition scent in water. They can alert to residual scent even if a body was present in a location but has since been moved. The chemical signature of human decomposition is distinctive and persistent, and these dogs' noses are sensitive enough to detect it in incredibly minute quantities. The handlers worked the dog systematically through every part of the property. Inside the house, they went room by room. The children's bedrooms, the master bedroom, the kitchen and living areas, the bathroom, the basement if there was one, every closet, every crawl space, every area where something could have happened or where remains could have been temporarily stored. Outside, they covered the yard, the play areas where the swings and other equipment were located, the perimeter where the property met the forest, the outbuildings including the structure where Janie Mackenzie lived, the vehicles parked on the property. Every location was methodically searched. And here's what's significant. The dogs showed interest in multiple locations. They didn't give full trained alerts, the sitting or lying down response that indicates the definite presence of decomposition scent strong enough to suggest remains. But they showed interest behavior, intense sniffing at certain spots, pawing at the ground or at floors, circling back to certain locations multiple times. Behavior indicating they were detecting something, some scent or trace that caught their attention, but not at levels strong enough to give a final alert. This interest behavior is actually more frustrating for investigators than either a clear alert or no response at all. A clear alert would give them a location to focus on, probable cause to start digging or tearing up flooring. No response would suggest remains weren't present, but interest without a full alert leaves things ambiguous. The dog smelled something biological. Something that could be human decomposition, but at such low levels or such degraded state that they couldn't give a definitive signal. There are several possible explanations for this kind of response. 1. The dogs detected actual human decomposition from the children, but the remains had been moved or cleaned up before the searches occurred days after the disappearance, leaving only residual scent. 2. Something happened in those locations that involved bodily fluids, blood or other biological material, that left scent the dogs picked up on even though it wasn't decomposition per se. 3. The dogs detected decomposition from other sources, animal remains or something else biological, that created false interest signals. 4. The dogs were responding to environmental factors that had nothing to do with human remains, but that mimicked scent patterns they're trained to recognize. Forensic teams collected samples from every location where the dogs showed interest. Soil samples from the yard, swabs from floors and walls inside the house, material from drains that might contain biological residue, carpet fibers. All of it was carefully documented, packaged, and sent to laboratories for detailed analysis. They were looking for traces of human DNA, specifically DNA from Lily and Jack. They were looking for blood residue that might have been cleaned but left microscopic traces. They were looking for chemical markers that indicate decomposition. They were conducting tests that can detect biological material even after extensive cleaning efforts. The results of those laboratory analyses have not been made fully public. Most of the information about what was found is heavily redacted in the court documents that have been released. This is standard practice. If investigators found evidence that could be used in a criminal prosecution, they're not going to reveal it publicly and give defense attorneys months or years to develop explanations before trial. Evidence gets held close, revealed only when charges are filed or at trial. So the fact that we don't know what the lab test showed doesn't mean nothing was found. It could mean something significant was found and is being protected as evidence. Or it could mean the tests were inconclusive, showing things that are suspicious but not definitive enough to prove a crime occurred. What we can infer is that if the tests had completely ruled out any possibility of human remains or biological evidence at all the tested locations, investigators wouldn't continue to treat this as a suspicious disappearance. They would have moved on, accepted that the children genuinely wandered off and their bodies simply haven't been found in the vast wilderness. The fact that the investigation continues to focus heavily on the parents, that Malehya and Daniel remain under scrutiny, suggests the forensic results didn't rule anything out. They may have found enough to be suspicious, to maintain probable cause for continued investigation, but not quite enough to charge anyone beyond reasonable doubt. Let me share one more absolutely critical piece of the puzzle, something that reveals the true character of what was happening in that household. before Lily and Jack disappeared. When investigators interviewed teachers and staff at the elementary school the children attended, they heard things that painted a very concerning picture of the children's home life. Teachers are mandated reporters, meaning they're legally required to report suspicions of child abuse or neglect to authorities. They're trained to recognize signs that a child might not be safe at home. And several teachers who worked with Lily and Jack reported that they'd had concerns in the weeks and months before the disappearance. Nothing dramatic enough to constitute proof of abuse, but worrying signs nonetheless. Jack in particular drew attention. He sometimes came to school with bruises on his arms or legs. When teachers asked about the bruises, following standard protocol, Jack would give explanations that seemed plausible on the surface. He fell off his bike. He bumped into something while playing outside. He's clumsy and gets hurt a lot. These are explanations that could be completely innocent. Young children, especially active boys, do get bruised from normal play. But when the bruises are frequent, when they show patterns, when the explanations start to seem rehearsed, teachers notice. One teacher in particular, whose name has been withheld from public reports, became concerned enough to file a formal report with Nova Scotia's Child Protective Services several weeks before the children disappeared. The report detailed observations of bruising on Jack that appeared to be in various stages of healing, suggesting multiple incidents over time. The bruises were primarily on his upper arms, in locations consistent with being grabbed forcefully. The teacher noted that Jack seemed withdrawn, that he didn't play as energetically as other children his age, that he was very protective of his little sister Lily and always kept her close. What happened with that report? This is where the system failed tragically. Child Protective Services in Nova Scotia, like in most jurisdictions, are chronically overwhelmed, understaffed, and operating under impossible caseloads. Social workers are triaging constantly, prioritizing cases where children are in immediate severe danger. A report about bruising that could have innocent explanations from a family that wasn't previously known to the system would get logged and might get a follow-up visit scheduled, but it wouldn't trigger immediate intervention. The caseworker assigned to follow up might have been juggling 30 or 40 other cases, many of them more severe. A visit to the Sullivan home might have been scheduled for weeks or even months out. We don't know if a social worker ever made it to the property before the children disappeared. The records of Child Protective Services investigations are sealed by law, protected to prevent families from being stigmatized by investigations that don't result in findings of abuse. But the fact that there was a report, that there were documented concerns about these children raised by a trained professional who interacts with children daily, adds another layer of heartbreak to this case. Someone saw that something wasn't right. Someone tried to get help for Lily and Jack, but the help didn't come in time. Other teachers, when interviewed after the disappearance, shared additional observations. The children sometimes came to school in clothing that wasn't seasonally appropriate, wearing the same outfits multiple days in a row. Sometimes they seemed hungry, eating their school lunches ravenously as if they hadn't eaten breakfast. Lily's cough, the one that supposedly kept her home those last days, hadn't been that severe at school. She'd had a minor cold, but nothing that would normally keep a child home for multiple days. Teachers wondered if there was another reason the children were kept out of school those final days. When investigators compiled all of this information, when they looked at the complete picture of teachers' concerns, reports to child services, signs of possible neglect or abuse, it fit into a larger pattern. This wasn't a happy household where children were thriving. This was a home where kids were at minimum not being properly cared for, and potentially being actively harmed. And now those children were gone. The suspicious timeline, the lies about movements, the unexplained cache, the disturbing internet searches, the forensic findings, and the history of concerns about the children all pointed in the same direction. Now let's talk about Malehya Brooks Murray's behavior in the days immediately following the disappearance, because this is where cracks in the carefully maintained facade started to show publicly. In those first few days, she and Daniel maintained their united front. They appeared together at press conferences. They spoke to media outlets together. They presented as a couple united in grief and desperation to find their children. But then something changed. Less than a week after Lily and Jack vanished, Malehya left the area. She packed up Baby Meadow and went to stay with her family in another part of Nova Scotia, several hours away from Pictou County. This was unexpected. Most parents of missing children, even when the search has been scaled back, want to stay close to where their children were last seen. They feel like they need to be there in case the kids are found, in case there's news, in case they can do something to help. But Malehya left. And not only did she leave, she blocked Daniel Martell on social media, Facebook, Instagram, whatever platforms they'd been connected on, she cut him off completely. This was a very public severing of their relationship, visible to everyone who followed them online. According to family members who hosted Malehya during this time, family who were later interviewed by police, she was in terrible emotional shape, which would be entirely expected for a mother whose children have just vanished. But she wasn't just expressing grief about the missing children. She was expressing anger, specifically directed at Daniel. Family members reported hearing her make statements like, "This is all his fault," and "He knows what happened to them, and I should have protected them from him, and I never should have trusted him with my kids." These are extraordinarily significant statements. When a mother whose children are missing says that the stepfather knows what happened, that's not vague concern. That's an accusation. She's indicating she believes he's responsible. When she says she should have protected them from him, she's acknowledging she perceived him as a threat to their safety. These are not the words of someone who believes her partner is innocent, who believes they're in this tragedy together. These are the words of someone who suspects or knows that Daniel Martell harmed her children. When police followed up on these statements, when detectives traveled to where Malehya was staying to interview her about what she'd told family members, her responses became vague and evasive. She walked everything back, said she was just upset and looking for someone to blame, said the pain was unbearable and she needed to direct her anger somewhere, said she didn't really mean anything specific by those comments, said Daniel wasn't perfect, but she didn't actually think he'd harmed the children. She softened all the accusations, tried to take back the words, presented a much more conciliatory picture. But as any experienced investigator knows, initial statements are usually closer to truth. When someone speaks in an unguarded moment, when they're emotional and not thinking about the implications of their words, they tend to express what they truly believe. It's only later, after they've had time to think about consequences, to consult with lawyers, to consider how their words might be used, that they start walking things back and crafting more careful statements. Malehya's initial reaction was to blame Daniel, to accuse him of knowing what happened, to express regret about not protecting her children from him. That reveals what she truly believed in that moment. Then, after some time passed, after presumably some communication with Daniel or his family despite the social media blocking, after possibly consulting with legal advice about the implications of accusing him, her story changed. She reconciled with Daniel. They got back together. They resumed presenting a united front to police and to the public. They coordinated their stories, made sure their accounts aligned. Why would she do that? There are several possible explanations. One, her initial accusations were made in grief and anger and didn't reflect what she actually believes. She genuinely thinks Daniel is innocent, and she was just lashing out because the pain was overwhelming. Two, she suspects or knows Daniel's involvement, but she's afraid. Afraid of him physically. Afraid of what he might do to her or to baby Meadow if she doesn't cooperate with his story. Three, she knows or suspects his involvement, but realizes that if she turns on him, he could implicate her as well. Maybe she was complicit in what happened. Maybe she participated, or at minimum knew and didn't stop it. If she accuses him, he might tell police about her role. Better to maintain their combined story and hope neither breaks. 4. Someone, possibly a lawyer, explained to her that her accusations against Daniel without evidence could expose her to a defamation lawsuit and that it was better to stay quiet. We don't know which of these explanations is accurate, but the pattern of behavior, the initial accusations followed by walking them back, the separation followed by reconciliation, all of it suggests a very complex dynamic. This isn't a simple case of two innocent people united in grief. This is something messier, something involving guilt and fear and calculation. Now let's address the elephant in the room. As of today, in December 2025, 7 months after Lily and Jack Sullivan disappeared, neither Malehya Brooks-Murray nor Daniel Martell has been charged with any crime related to their children's disappearance. They haven't been arrested. They're living freely, presumably still together, still caring for their surviving daughter Meadow. In the eyes of Canadian law, they are innocent. They are entitled to the presumption of innocence until and unless Evidence proves their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. That's how the legal system works, and it's an important principle. But the court of public opinion operates under different rules, and based on the evidence that's emerged, based on the lies and inconsistencies and suspicious behaviors and forensic findings and witness statements, most people following this case closely have drawn their own conclusions. These don't look like grieving parents whose children tragically wandered off and got lost in the wilderness. These look like people who know exactly what happened to Lily and Jack, people who may be directly responsible for what happened, people who constructed an elaborate fiction to avoid accountability, people who almost fooled the world with their tears and their media appearances and their carefully practiced statements, almost but not quite. Because while they may have fooled casual observers, while they may have temporarily fooled even themselves into thinking their performance was believable, they didn't fool the investigators who were watching carefully and taking notes and gathering evidence. Piece by piece, methodically and patiently, detectives dismantled the story. They exposed the lies, they documented the inconsistencies, they gathered the financial records and the internet search history and the forensic samples. They built a case, and even if that case isn't quite strong enough yet to result in criminal charges, even if prosecutors have decided they can't prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt without bodies or confessions or more physical evidence, the investigation continues. The case remains open, and investigators know who they believe is responsible. The frustrating reality is that without bodies, prosecuting murder or manslaughter is extraordinarily difficult. Defense attorneys would argue that without proof the children are even dead, you can't prove murder. They'd argue the kids could still be alive somewhere, could have been taken by person or persons unknown, could have wandered off and somehow survived. They'd argue that suspicious behavior has innocent explanations, that people under stress act in ways that might seem odd but don't prove guilt. They'd create reasonable doubt, and if there's reasonable doubt, juries acquit. Prosecutors know this, which is why they're being extremely cautious about when and whether to bring charges. But here's what I believe happened, based on reviewing all the available evidence and the patterns that have emerged. I believe something occurred in that house during the evening of May 1st or the overnight hours into May 2nd. I don't know if it was intentional murder, if it was abuse that went too far, if it was neglect that resulted in death, or if it was some kind of accident that they then failed to report because they feared being blamed. But something happened that resulted in Lily and Jack Sullivan dying or being so severely injured that their survival was impossible. I believe Malehya and Daniel realized they couldn't explain what had happened without facing serious consequences, criminal charges, loss of their surviving child, public shame, prison. So they made a choice. They decided to cover it up, to make the children disappear, to create a story that would explain their absence. I believe they removed the bodies from the property, possibly during Daniel's late-night drive that he lied about, possibly the following morning, possibly both. I believe they disposed of the remains in a location that hasn't been found, maybe somewhere in the vast wilderness but far from their property, maybe in water where bodies might never surface, maybe somewhere else entirely. I believe they cleaned the scene to remove or minimize forensic evidence. I believe they staged sounds the next morning, the children's laughter and the swings creaking, to create a witness who could testify that the kids were alive at 9 a.m. And I believe they made that 911 call with a carefully prepared story, having rehearsed what they would say, how they would act, what narrative they would present. I believe the tears at press conferences were practiced, the result of preparation, not genuine grief. I believe every media appearance was calculated to maintain the fiction. I believe they coordinated their stories, made sure their accounts aligned closely enough to seem consistent, and I believe they almost got away with it. If investigators had taken their story at face value, if the searches had just concluded the kids were lost in the wilderness and the case had been closed, Malehya and Daniel would have successfully fooled the world. But they didn't account for how thoroughly modern investigations are conducted. They didn't account for security cameras catching Daniel's truck at a gas station. They didn't account for forensic analysis of their internet searches. They didn't account for cadaver dogs detecting scents at their property. They didn't account for investigators noticing all the small inconsistencies in their story and pulling on those threads until the whole fabrication started to unravel. The investigation continues. Police haven't given up. The case file grows thicker every week with new information, new analysis, new leads followed. The reward of $150,000 still stands for information that leads to finding the children or to criminal charges being filed. Someone out there may know something. Maybe someone Malehya or Daniel confided in. Maybe someone who helped dispose of bodies. Maybe someone who saw something suspicious and didn't realize its significance at the time. That information could break this case open. And there's always the possibility that one of them will eventually talk. The stress of maintaining a lie like this, the guilt if there's any conscience at all, the fear of eventually being caught, all of it takes a psychological toll. Relationships fracture under that kind of pressure. People make mistakes. Someone gets drunk and says too much. Someone has a crisis of conscience. Someone decides the burden of the secret is too heavy to carry anymore. It happens more often than you'd think in cases like this. Years pass and then suddenly someone talks, and a cold case becomes an active prosecution. So Malehya Brooks Murray and Daniel Martell may think they fooled the world. They may think they've gotten away with whatever happened to Lily and Jack. But the truth has a way of emerging. Justice may be delayed, but it often arrives eventually. And when it does, when the full story finally comes to light, the world will see them for what investigators already believe they are. Not grieving parents, not victims of tragedy, but perpetrators. People who harmed two innocent children and then lied about it to the world. What do you think? Have Malehya and Daniel fooled you, or do you see through the performance? Do you believe they're responsible for what happened to Lily and Jack? Or do you think there's another explanation, that they're innocent and just being wrongly suspected because of how they handled an impossibly traumatic situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss the evidence, analyze their behavior, and see what conclusions we reach as a community. If you believe in demanding accountability, if you think cases like this need attention until justice is served, subscribe to True Crime Vault right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and smash that like. Share this video with anyone following the Sullivan case. The more people paying attention, the harder it is for guilty parties to escape consequences. The more pressure that builds, the more likely it becomes that someone will finally tell the truth. And if you're watching this and you have any information about what happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan, contact the Royal Canadian Mounted Police immediately. The tip line is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can remain anonymous. You might be eligible for the $150,000 reward. But more importantly, you'd be doing the right thing for two children who deserve to be found, who deserve to come home, who deserve justice for whatever was done to them. Thank you for watching. Lily Sullivan was 6 years old. Jack Sullivan was 4 years old. They deserved to grow up, to go to school, to have friends, to experience all the joys of childhood and life. Instead, they disappeared on May 2nd, 2025, and 7 months later they're still missing. But the search for truth continues. The investigation continues. And one way or another, eventually, the full story will emerge. The people responsible will be exposed, and justice will be served. We'll be here covering every development when it happens.